Last January, Suzanne Perlman and I paid a visit to John and Anna Ellerbe's house. It was our first visit to the delightful town of Port Royal, South Carolina. I had long wanted to see John's collection of board games. John and Anna were wonderful hosts, and we thoroughly enjoyed our visit with them. John's home houses some of the oldest games in his collection. They were early games from Parker, McLaughlin, Milton Bradley, and others. The walls of his living room were adorned with framed European board games from the 1800s. However, the best part of John's collection resides in a building in the rear of his house. In the backyard stands a building. This building is called the John Ellerbe Memorial Game Museum. We spent many hours here looking at his collection and listening to stories from John about his interest in board games.
Hello, I'm John Ellerbe, and this is my historical game museum. I'll give you some stories.
John invited us into the darkened room. The first thing we noticed was the tiger paw pillow on the sofa. When he turned the lights on, we saw a collection of games that went from the floor to the ceiling. The games were nicely displayed and sorted by category or type of game. On the left-hand side of the room were abstract strategy games. Next to the strategy games were some European games. John had an 8-foot ladder handy so that I could climb up to the higher shelves of the room. The far right-hand corner of the room contained John's collection of war games. We started our discussion by asking John when he first became interested in board games. Yeah, so you want to tell us about when you got involved with games? You said, I think you told me that it was an aunt or somebody who got you involved.
My aunt lived in North Carolina. She was a school teacher, and she was not married and didn't have any children. So I was the only relative that was a child that was close in the family. So on my 7th birthday, she came to Charleston, and the war was, over. My dad was back home, and so we all gave her a greeting, and it was sort of amusing because my aunt was somewhat what you would call back in the old days prissy. She was kind of a, very much into herself, and my dad couldn't resist. That was his sister. When she came in the house and ushered down to the chair in the corner, which looked like to be the most comfortable, my dad had put a whoopee cushion underneath the cushion. And so when she sat down, it made this terrible noise. And she wasn't the kind to take a joke easy. But she got over it. She got mad, but she got over it. And she said she'd come. She wanted to get a birthday present for me, but she didn't know what I liked. So I said, she said, I'll take you uptown and I'll get you anything you'd like to get. Well, she was somewhat thrifty, so she didn't mean anything. But nonetheless, we went up for a walk. We lived on Meeting Street, which goes north and south, and King Street goes north and south. But King Street is unique. It's one of the few cities in America where the main shopping street is one way. It's from Calhoun Street all the way down to the Battery is all north to south only. Walking is okay, but it's unusual to have a main street where all the major retail outlets and so forth are only approachable by car by one way. So we walked up and we got up to a store that I knew about even though I was 7 years old. It was called Ledgertons. And they sold office equipment and stuff, papers and typewriter paper and stuff like that. And they had one little table over in the corner because I'd walked in there with my mom, and they had toys and games. So I said, I want to go over here. I went over to the place where the little table was, and I walked around the table, and I picked up this box, and it was Monopoly. And I said, I want this. She said, well, are you sure? You didn't take much time. I want this. So, okay. I don't think it cost too much money. She was a little tight-fisted, so if it had been really expensive, it would have been a bigger problem.
Mm-hmm.
But we bought it and took it home. And I took it home, and by the next day, we had our first... I had to teach my parents how to play Monopoly. And I remember I'm 7.
Right.
And I think the aunt was still there, and so she played. And we played the first whole game, and it got about okay, and it worked out just fine. And after she went home, I then was pestering my parents to play. And they'd play, and they'd get more and more grumpy about it because they weren't understanding the concepts. They hadn't had many board games to play on. And so finally, at the end of about the 4th time my dad had tried it, he said, I'm not doing that anymore. I'm going to name it something else. I'm going to call it Monotony. So he, for the rest of my life, called Monopoly Monotony. He didn't get any better at it either. But from then on, every time I had a chance or some money given to me, I was out looking for games to buy.
Mm-hmm.
And so I probably had about 20 games as a kid. And I loved to play them. I played with my children, other children, friends. There were 4 daughters that lived up the street, all from the same family.
Mm-hmm.
And there weren't any other kids on the street. So my big playmate scheme were these 4 little girls. One was younger than me, 2 were my age, and one was like 1 year older. And so it was a great way to have friends and play with nice-looking girls and have a good time, and Monopoly was a good start.
Okay.
So I have fond memories of Monopoly after I got over the part about the monotony.
You see any value in...
All this reminiscing reminds me of something about game collecting that was just came to light.
Mm-hmm.
I had a game called Cargoes.
Okay.
And I was I think, 2nd or 3rd grade.
Mm-hmm.
And Cargoes was a relatively simple game where you were bringing commerce from over the oceans to different countries and making money by how much you delivered at a certain port,
mm-hmm.
etc. And it wasn't very complex. It was something that a youngster could use.
Uh-huh.
But what was the upshot was in school, all of a sudden I was the only person in class that knew what crops and treasures came from what parts of the world.
Okay.
Because I'd been playing this game and I knew where all the history of rare products would come from.
Mm-hmm.
I was just sitting there, we were talking about it, I just suddenly flashed and remember how I was getting pats on the back from the teacher from a game. And I really think playing games, whether you're a youngster or a teenager, in college or an adult, even a senior, playing in games helps stimulate the brain,
mm-hmm.
allow you to appreciate more of the surroundings around you, and keep you from being just sort of a dud.
Yeah.
Well, I don't think I had a plan at the beginning.
Okay.
It was just catch as catch can.
Okay.
So I'd see a game that looked like it'd be interesting, and I'd grab it,
Mm-hmm.
or buy it, or barter for it.
Mm-hmm.
But we weren't terribly sophisticated at that early stage. In fact, in the first convention, I've uttered the famous line, because they said, I asked the people in the sitting room where everybody was gathered, I said, which ones of these games are the best ones to play? And a couple of ladies said, silly man, we don't play these games, we just have them because we like the way they look. And that was our first kind of wet water reply we had of anybody about game collecting. But I never got discouraged, and Anna supported me all the way, and I found out about interesting games, and every time you find out one really interesting, pretty soon there'd be another one a little bit more interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So it was somewhat contagious.
Yeah.
And we met Herb Siegel.
What?
And then we got very friendly with Herb Siegel. And you bought a lot of games from Herb, a lot of the antique games. He'd have games that he'd bring to the convention that he wanted to sell to John.
Mm.
And before anything got really going, like Friday afternoon, he'd say to John, I have some really good scotch in my room. Come over and have a drink, and I want to show you some games.
Oh.
And some of his best antique games he got from Herb.
Okay.
So but it was always done surreptitiously
Yeah.
before the convention started, and there was always alcohol involved.
Okay.
What's wrong with that?
All right, so this game here, I'm somewhat familiar with. I remember the day you purchased this. It was up in New Jersey at the first Sid Saxon auction.
Yes.
And this was in the first lot that went during the first auction. So you had the honor of buying the first auction, the first lot that was sold, and this was inside of it. And I had no idea when you bought it that this game was inside the lot.
Well, I knew if everybody knew what it was at the time, I wouldn't have been able to buy it because if somebody would have passed my efforts.
Yeah.
So I would think this is a gem, and inside it's really interesting too.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah, I know it's a game that was published in France
yes,
during the 1950s, I believe.
and he sent letters and correspondence and
Yeah, he sent
prototypes.
sent the game to Sid Saxon.
Sid Saxon.
And Sid Saxon, I know, thought quite a bit of it because he actually had a photograph taken with him looking at this game with the game open in his lap. And Sid did quite a bit of correspondence back and forth with the developer of the game. And
With all this credentials about the background and the correspondence between the two people and the two continents, it is on its way. It almost makes it more valuable than any other board game you can buy in a box.
yeah, it's nice to have all this stuff written longhand by Sid regarding the game. And it is an interesting game. We'll go ahead and look at the board.
And look at the pieces, all the nice things.
Yeah. The pieces are pretty unique. He didn't put a date on it, but 1954 is the copyright on the game. So it was obviously sometime in the 50s
Yeah.
when it was received by Sid. And I did find that there was one copy that's available on Board Game Geek a while back.
Really?
But yeah, and that's the only other time I've seen this game anywhere on the internet.
But it probably didn't include the
Obviously,
correspondence.
It did not have include the correspondence.
So whatever that price was, it's double for this one.
I'm sure.
Anyway, I haven't played it, obviously. It wouldn't mean I wouldn't if I had the right opponent.
Okay.
But it's nice to have something like this. It's sort of a history, not only as a game, but also from people involved and who they were in the game world.
Yes. Okay.
So that's one of my gems.
Okay.
And I saw darts of envy when I was carrying it out of the...
Oh yeah, everybody noticed it because you opened it up right there during the auction. So.
And the only reason I was actually able to get it, even though it was just, is because when everybody goes to an auction and there's a lot of things they're interested in looking at, and something comes up early and it's very early in the auction and they haven't even examined it, and they have their money set to bid on this or that or the third item, they don't want to go too high on something right out the bat because
Right.
it'll deplete their funds and it may not be what they thought.
Yeah.
So I was lucky to be there in that position and be able to bid while everybody was still kind of with their hands in their pockets.
That's right. I remember. I watched you play pickleball the other day, and most of the people that were down in the pickleball court knew that you had a game collection. So I guess most of your neighbors are very familiar with the fact that you have a...
Well, it's been helped because there was an article in the newspaper,
Okay.
and there's a magazine for this area, and I've had a full write-up in both of those areas.
Okay.
And I've given talks at the university.
Uh-huh.
They have a place where they have various subjects about the Southland. People give talks about something they know, and I've made short talks about games.
Okay.
Twice, taking some of my samples and tell people there's a lot of better games than what you can buy at Sears.
Okay. Well, that's interesting because I assume a lot of those folks have come in here and taken a look at your collection.
Well, I get the most traffic when we have porch parties.
Porch parties, okay.
And there's so many people in there and all milling around and drinking and having food at the fire and getting goodies that Anna's made. And I'm in here taking 6 at a time and giving them a short rundown.
Okay.
And they say, can I come by sometime and show this to my children?
Okay.
So I get a lot of feedback and a lot of enjoyment from the fact that other people like it. That's almost as much as playing.
And why don't you tell us what a porch party is, because a lot of people probably aren't familiar with that term.
Well, I didn't invent it, but somewhere along the way they decided that people moving here typically didn't live here close by. They didn't move across the street. They came from somewhere else, and so they didn't know anybody. And there weren't that many community activities that would make a getting acquainted process be short. It would be long, drawn-out thing. But when they started saying, okay, every month we'll have somebody in town be the host of a porch party. And everybody's invited. Bring your own liquor, beer or whatever. Soft drinks would be there and sort of provided, as well as snacks and desserts and a little bit of food. And people mingle around and talk and say, oh, by the way, you need to meet so-and-so. They just moved here last month. So somebody will take you over and introduce you to somebody that's new. Or take the new person and introduce them to somebody who's old. And it's the best way I have ever seen of how letting a small community get to know new people. And then after a while, you're walking down the street and you see somebody that you met at the porch party, and they'll say, "Hi, John. Hi, Ray. How are you?"
Okay.
And you'll stop and have a little chat. So it's a wonderful location for having community goodwill.
John showed me some additional games from the Sid Saxon auction. Many of these games contain personal letters from Sid to the game designer. Most of the games had detailed notes and dates related to Sid's acquisition of the game. Then we looked at some games that John had purchased at the Essen convention in Germany. Many of these were still sealed in their original packaging. Then we looked at some of the more colorful games in John's collection. These games had unique pieces and interesting boards. John and Anna encourage all AGPI members to visit John's museum. I hope that you enjoyed this video as much as we enjoyed creating it. This video is only a peek into John's large board game collection. John, thank you for your steadfast determination to make all 34 of our conventions. As Debbie Krim said, you won, and so did the AGPI for having you as a member.